I'm a hunter, and for months my trail camera filmed Bigfoot coming back to my property, but nothing prepared me for what he was willing to do to kick me out of my own house. What that final clip shows is so brutal, Bigfoot made sure nobody would believe it when I showed it to them. My name is Jesse Stroud. I moved onto this property in September 2015 because I wanted land of my own, quiet mornings, and nobody telling me what to do with my weekends. I got all of that. What I did not get was any kind of warning about what was already living here before I showed up with my lumber and my big plans. The clearing crew finished on a Thursday. By Sunday morning, something had gone through the eastern edge of my property and snapped 3 trees at about 8 feet off the ground. Not knocked over, not uprooted, snapped, like someone had grabbed them and just broken them the way you'd break a pencil. I walked out there with my coffee and stood looking at it for a good 5 minutes, trying to work out what could have done that. My first thought was wind. My second thought was that I have lived through plenty of wind, and wind has never once snapped a tree at a consistent 8 feet like it was trying to make a point. My third thought was that maybe I should have bought that condo instead. I told myself it was probably the clearing equipment. Maybe one of the crew had clipped them on the way out, and I just hadn't noticed. I went back inside and finished my coffee and felt pretty good about that explanation for about 2 days. Then I found the footprint. It was in the mud at the creek edge on the eastern boundary, 14 inches long, 5 toes, pressed so deep into the ground that whatever made it had to be carrying serious weight on that foot. I put my own boot next to it, and my boot looked like a child's shoe. I stood there staring at it, and then I looked up at the tree line, and there was not a single bird calling, not a single branch moving, nothing rustling in the undergrowth, just total dead silence on a morning that had been plenty noisy 5 minutes before I got there. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, and I want you to know that I am a practical man who does not panic. So naturally, I ordered 6 trail cameras, 2 motion sensors, and an audio recorder, and had them shipped overnight. I had the cameras up by Wednesday, 6 of them spread across the eastern boundary, covering every angle I could manage, strapped to trees, motion activated, night vision on all of them. I have set up trail cameras more times than I can count for deer season, and I can usually get through the whole process without thinking too hard about it. This time, I kept stopping, not because the setup was difficult, but because the woods were doing that thing again, where everything goes quiet the moment you pay attention to it. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving in the undergrowth. Just me out there screwing mounts into bark and trying not to feel like I was being watched while I set up equipment specifically to catch whatever was watching me. I finished around noon, walked back to the house, and told myself that whatever showed up on those cards was going to have a perfectly reasonable explanation. A bear maybe, an unusually large one. I was going to pull that footage in a week and feel a little embarrassed about the overnight shipping charge. That is not what happened. I pulled the first card after 6 days. I sat down at my kitchen table the same way I always do, coffee on the left, laptop open, ready to scroll through a week of deer and raccoons and maybe a coyote if I was lucky. The first 3 nights were normal. Deer moving through at dusk, a possum at around 11, the usual. I was actually starting to feel good about myself and my very reasonable bear theory. Then I got to Thursday night at 2 a.m. and I stopped scrolling. It was upright. It was massive, moving through the eastern edge of the cleared zone at a pace that was slow and deliberate in a way that made my stomach do something unpleasant. I rewound it and watched it again. Then I watched it a third time, leaning close enough to the screen that I could see my own reflection in it. I have been hunting my whole adult life, and I know what every animal looks like on a trail camera at 2 in the morning. I know what a bear looks like when it stands up. I know what a tall man in dark clothing looks like. I know what shadows do at the edge of an infrared field, and this was none of those things. I sat back in my chair and looked at my coffee going cold on the left side of the table, and I said it out loud even though there was nobody in that kitchen to hear it. Bigfoot, not as a question and not as a joke either. Just the word sitting there in the air because it was the only one that fit what I was looking at, and I am too old to spend energy pretending otherwise. I called my brother that same night and told him what was on the footage. He asked me to send him the clip. I sent it. He called back 10 minutes later and told me it was a bear and that I needed to get out of the house more. I thanked him for his input and hung up. And then maybe 4 days after I pulled that first card, I was out at dusk checking the cameras and topping up the batteries on the 2 eastern ones. The light was going flat the way it does in late October, that gray hour where everything loses its edges and the tree line just becomes one long dark wall. I was about halfway through swapping the battery on the second camera when I heard the undergrowth shift. It was not the sound of a small animal or a branch settling. It was the sound of something with serious weight behind it, adjusting its position the way a large animal sounds when it has been standing still for a while and decides to move. I stopped what I was doing and looked up. It was standing at the edge of the trees about 50 feet away from me. I know what you are probably picturing, and that is not what this was. It was not lunging at me, and it was not screaming. It was just standing there in the gray light, looking directly at me, the way you look at someone who has walked into a room they were not invited into. That was exactly what it felt like too, standing there, holding a trail camera battery in my hand, like an idiot, like I had walked into a room that belonged to someone else and gotten caught. Neither of us moved for close to a full minute. I counted because I needed something to do with my brain that was not panicking. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone, and I stood there in the gray light alone and noticed that my legs had started shaking at some point during that minute without asking my permission. I went inside that night and pulled up the footage from all 6 cameras covering the eastern boundary. I was looking for a better angle of what I had just seen, something that gave me more detail than my own 2 eyes had managed in that gray light, and I did find it on camera 3. There it was, same figure, same tree line, pretty much exactly what I remembered. But then I checked camera 5, which covers the area behind and to the left of where I had been standing, and I watched it once, and then I watched it again, because my brain was genuinely refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. While I had been standing there staring at the one at the tree line, a second one had come out of the woods on the left side of the property and closed to within 60 feet of me from behind. 60 feet away, and I never heard it coming, never felt anything behind me, never had a single instinct fire that told me something that large was standing that close to the back of my head. It just stood there the whole time I was having my little staring contest with the first one. And then, when the first one stepped back into the trees, the second one turned around and walked back into the woods like it had somewhere else to be. I sat with that footage for a long time that night, because here is what that means. 2 of them, that close, and nothing happened. Which sounds like good news until you really think about it. Something that size deciding not to act is not the same as something that size being unable to act. That was a choice. And whatever the reason behind that choice was, I was fairly certain it had nothing to do with being afraid of me. After the footage from that night, I stopped thinking about this as a trail camera project and started thinking about it as something I needed to actually understand. So I spent a few days doing something I probably should have done before I ever signed the deed on this property, which was looking into the land itself. I pulled the survey maps and walked the property with them, tracing exactly where the clearing crew had worked against what I was finding on the ground. And when I laid those 2 things on top of each other, the picture that came together was not one I felt great about. The stand of trees I had taken down was not sitting in a random patch of forest. It was sitting directly on a natural corridor that ran along the eastern boundary, following the creek line, moving through a gap between 2 ridges to the north. A route that anything large moving through this part of the country would use, because the terrain funneled you there, whether you were a deer or a bear, or apparently something considerably larger than either. I had not cleared a patch of trees. I had taken out a section of a road, one that had been in use for a long time by something that did not appreciate the renovation. I drove out to the cleared zone that evening and stood at the stumps of the trees I had taken down and looked at what I had done to that corridor, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it surprised me. It was not fear, and it was not defensiveness. It was guilt, plain and simple guilt, the same feeling you get when you break something that belonged to someone else. And I remember standing there thinking, did I even check what was out here before I let those guys start the chainsaws? Did I even ask? The answer was no. I had not asked because it had not occurred to me that there was anyone to ask. I went down to the creek bed the following morning with a flashlight and a measuring tape. I was thinking maybe some older prints, a few seasons worth of activity, enough to confirm that the corridor had been in regular use. I went down there looking for a few old prints, and what I found instead made me stand in that creek for 10 minutes, just staring at the ground like I had never seen mud before. The prints were layered, pressed into the dried mud and stone at different depths, different ages, Some of them recent enough that the edges were still sharp, and some of them so old they had basically become part of the rock itself. The same stride, the same size, the same route, over and over again, going back further than I could put a number on. I am not a geologist, and I cannot tell you exactly how old the deepest ones were. What I can tell you is that the tree stumps I was feeling guilty about the night before were saplings the last time something had not been walking through this creek bed. So how long had this been going on? How many years was something using this corridor before a single human being had any claim to this land at all? I did not have an answer for that standing in that creek bed, and I still do not have one now. What I had was a measuring tape, a flashlight, and the slowly settling realization that whatever I had disturbed when I started my clearing crew was not a recent arrival that had wandered onto my property. It had been here so much longer than me that the word trespasser did not apply to either one of us. And it definitely did not apply to the one leaving 14-inch prints in the rock. This was November 2015. I was out fixing the eastern fence line on a Saturday afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just replacing a section that had come loose over the winter before I moved in. It was maybe 3 in the afternoon. Good light. Nothing about the day that suggested I should be anywhere other than where I was. The wood knocks started about 20 minutes into the job. 3 of them from somewhere deep in the tree line, each one louder than the one before it. I had never heard wood knocking before in person, and I remember my first thought was that someone was doing construction work somewhere on the other side of the tree line. That thought lasted about 4 seconds, because the second knock was closer than the first, and the third one was closer still, and whatever was making that sound was not on the other side of anything. It was moving toward me through the trees, and it was not trying to be quiet about it. Then the tree line erupted. That is the only word I have for it. Something moved through the trees parallel to where I was standing, and it covered the full length of my fence line in maybe 8 seconds. I could hear branches the size of my forearm snapping clean off as it went. I could feel the footfalls coming up through the ground into the soles of my boots. It never came out of the trees, and it never showed itself, but it did not need to because the message was loud enough without a visual aid. I had been out here long enough, and I needed to wrap that up now. I put my tools down slowly, picked up my truck keys, and walked back to the house. I did not run, not because I was calm. I was not calm, but because somewhere in the back of my head, I had the very strong feeling that running was exactly the wrong thing to do. I showed the footage to a buddy from work the following week. 3 months of clips, the territorial markers, the whole thing laid out in order. He watched it for about 10 minutes and then told me I should look into getting a game warden out there. I asked him if he had actually watched what I just showed him. He said he had, and that it was probably a bear. I stopped showing people the footage after that, for a while anyway. I did not sleep well that November, so I spent a lot of nights at my kitchen table going down research holes. The thing that stopped me first was the Sierra Sounds, recordings made in the California wilderness in the 1970s of vocalizations that a retired Navy cryptolinguist named R. Scott Nelson formally analyzed and concluded showed the structural characteristics of a real language. Not human, not any known animal. I put my headphones on and listened to it alone in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, and I am not going to pretend that was a comfortable experience. Then I found something called infrasound, and everything I had felt in October suddenly had a name. It is sound at frequencies below what human ears can consciously hear, and the effect on people nearby is a feeling of dread with no obvious source. I read that and went completely still, because that was exactly what I had felt during the first encounter. That pressure in my chest that I could not explain. It had been communicating with me since October, and I had not even known there was a message being sent. I did a full walk of the property boundary one morning and started noticing things I had either missed before or that had not been there before. I am still not sure which. Specific trees along the eastern boundary had their bark stripped in deliberate patterns at a consistent height, around 8 feet up, the same height as the snapped trees from September. Large rocks that had no business being that far from the creek had been repositioned along the edge of the cleared zone, placed at intervals that were too consistent to be accidental. And the section of fence line I had been repairing when the wood knocks started had been pulled apart again, not broken. Pulled, the posts worked loose from the ground and moved aside at the exact point where the fence crossed the corridor route. I walked the full boundary and took photographs of everything, and when I got back to the house and looked through them all together, the message was pretty clear. This is where your land ends. This is where ours begins. The fact that my deed said otherwise was apparently not a compelling argument. After finding those markers, I wanted to know how far the corridor actually extended beyond my property. So I spent a few days walking the creek line in both directions past my boundary. I talked to 2 neighbors whose land bordered mine on the north and south ends and asked them casually if they had noticed anything unusual in the woods. One of them looked at me for a long moment before he said anything, and then just told me he did not go past the creek anymore and changed the subject. The other one had not been on his back acreage in over a year, and when I asked why, he said the dogs refused to go back there. I kept walking the creek line on my own after that. The corridor did not start at my property, and it did not end there either. It ran continuously in both directions as far as I followed it. Same signs, same stripped bark at the same height, same repositioned rocks marking the edges. My fence, my survey markers, my property lines meant absolutely nothing to whatever was using this route. Those boundaries were a human idea, and this thing had been here long before humans in this county had started drawing lines on maps and arguing about who owned what. I remember standing at my northern property marker, this little orange stake in the ground that I had paid a surveyor $400 to put there, and thinking that it was probably the most meaningless $400 I had ever spent. I found the first one on a Monday morning in December 2015, a full-grown deer at the edge of the cleared zone, right where the corridor met the boundary I had disturbed. It had not been killed there. The ground around it was not disturbed enough for that, and there was barely any predation damage on it. It had been carried there and set down in that specific spot, deliberately, and I already knew by December what was large enough and strong enough to do that on my property. What I did not know was why. 2 weeks later, there was a second one at the same spot, same careful placement, same minimal damage, and this time beside it, pressed into the soft ground, was a handprint, 4 fingers and a thumb, the palm roughly twice the width of mine. I put my own hand next to it and looked at the size difference for a while. Something that leaves a print that size had just carried a full-grown deer across my property and placed it at the edge of my cleared zone like it was making a point. And I think that is exactly what it was doing. It was not a gift, and it was not a coincidence. It was a demonstration. It was showing me what it was capable of carrying, how close it had been to my property line, and how little my cleared zone meant as a boundary to something that size. Up until January 2016, everything had been happening at the tree line. The encounters, the markers, the carcasses, all of it out there at the eastern boundary. That changed on a Wednesday night in January. I woke up at 2 a.m. to my dogs standing frozen in the middle of the bedroom, hackles up, staring at the back wall. Then I felt it, a pressure transferring through the exterior of the house, moving slowly from one end of the back wall to the other, like something running its hand along the outside of my house in the dark. I got my rifle and sat in the corner chair until sunrise. The porch cameras caught the bottom 20 inches of it, passing each lens as it made one full circle around the house and walked back toward the tree line. I watched that footage in the morning and understood that everything before this had been a warning. This was something else entirely. I drove to my neighbor's property that same morning, the one who had told me early on that he did not go past the creek anymore. I showed him the porch camera footage on my phone and watched his face while he watched it. He handed my phone back and told me he did not want to be involved. That was the last time I tried to tell anyone about what was happening on this property. After the night it circled the house, I started looking into who had owned this property before me. It took me about a week to track down the man who had sold it, an older farmer who had moved 3 counties away and did not have much of an online presence. I found a phone number through the county records, and I called him on a Tuesday afternoon. He picked up on the 3rd ring. When I told him why I was calling, he was quiet for a long time before he said anything. Long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Then he started talking, and he did not stop for almost an hour. He had experienced everything I had experienced, and then some. The footage, the wood knocks, the territorial markers, the carcasses. It had come to his house too, and he told me that when it did, it had not stopped at the wall the way it had with me. He would not go into detail about what happened after that. What he did say was that he had his family packed and out of that house in under a week, and that he had not driven past the county line since. Before he hung up, he said one thing that I have thought about every day since. He said he was sorry he had not left a note. After that phone call, I went back into the county records and started looking at the ownership history of this specific parcel of land. What I found was a pattern that was hard to look at once I saw it. Nobody stayed long. The tenures were short, some of them less than a year, and they went back further than I expected. Every few years, the land changed hands quietly, with no real explanation in any document I could find. I managed to track down 2 other previous owners, besides the farmer. One was a woman who simply said she did not want to talk about it and hung up. The other was a man who stayed on the phone long enough to tell me that whatever I was dealing with out there had been going on for as long as anyone in that county could remember, and that the smart move was to sell while I still felt like it was my idea. Every encounter up to this point had been at dusk or in the dark. That changed on a Saturday morning in February 2016. I was in my backyard drinking coffee and looking at a section of roof that needed attention when I looked up and it was standing at the edge of the yard 40 feet away in full daylight. This was the first time I had seen it clearly, not through a camera lens, not in failing light. 40 feet away in the middle of a Saturday morning, and I could see everything, the full height of it, somewhere around 8 feet, the width of the shoulders, the way it held itself with a stillness that felt more like patience than anything else. It looked at me, then it turned its head slowly toward the house, then back to me. It did this twice, and then it just stood there and waited. I understood what it was saying without needing it explained. After everything since September 2015, the message was clear enough. Make a decision. Because as far as it was concerned, I was the problem, and the problem was still standing in its yard drinking coffee. I am not going to pretend the daylight encounter did not get to me, because it did. That night I packed a bag, put it by the door, and sat in my truck in the driveway at 4 a.m. with the engine running. I had built this house with my own hands and put everything I had into this land, and I sat there in the dark, running the numbers on whether any of that was still worth what was happening. I thought about what the previous owner had said on the phone, that the people who left did not stop being afraid, they just moved their fears somewhere smaller. I sat with that for a while, then I turned the engine off, went back inside, and put the bag in the closet. I decided I was not leaving, so I stood there and I took it, 2 of them screaming from the dark on either side of me, and then I took 1 step back, then another. I kept my eyes on the tree line and kept stepping back slowly, 1 foot at a time, all the way across the property until I hit the porch steps. I went inside and locked the door and went straight to the window that faces the eastern tree line. I stood there in the dark of my own living room looking out at the woods for a long time. I could not see anything, but the screaming had stopped the moment I reached the porch, and that told me enough about how closely it had been watching me walk back. It was just standing there 20 feet away watching me, and it was holding something at its side, a dead animal hanging from one hand while it stood completely still and watched me the entire time, just holding it there like it was the most normal thing in the world. And the screaming from the tree line, the thing I had spent the whole night focused on, that had just been the thing it wanted me looking at, while this one walked out of the woods and stood 20 feet away with a bloody carcass in its hand. That is not random behavior. Every encounter had been a step, and every interaction had been a question. Does he run? Does he panic? Does he stop coming out here? And the answer every single time had been no. I had stood my ground through the wood knocks and the carcasses and the house and the screaming, and I had done it without fully understanding that standing my ground was exactly what was being measured. It had spent 7 months deciding whether I was worth tolerating on this land. The final encounter answered that question in a way I was not expecting. Late March 2016. I was standing at the edge of the cleared zone at dusk when I heard it coming through the tree line before I saw it. Branches snapping, ground shaking, and then it walked out and stopped 10 feet away from me. 10 feet. I have been scared before in these woods. Not like that. I could hear it breathing. My rifle was back at the house, and I already knew that was a problem. Then the infrasound hit harder than it ever had before. It went through my chest, my legs, my hands. Everything in me said run, and I could not move. And then it opened its mouth. It built in my chest before I heard it with my ears, and when it finally came out, it was one word, rough and wrong, but clear enough that there was no question about what it said. Leave. My legs were shaking when I walked back to the house. I thought about the previous owner. I thought about every person whose name was on that deed before mine and what they each decided when they got to this same point. I built this house with my own hands, and I was not going to let anything run me off it. I understood what I had disturbed, and I was not going to clear any more trees. That felt like the fairest thing I could offer. For 7 months, my trail cameras recorded Bigfoot on my property, and nobody believed me. I am still here, and so is it.